How much money does Dunder Mifflin make, and how much money is Michael Scott responsible for? I've wondered it. You may have wondered it. So I decided to do an Excel breakdown of Dunder Mifflin Scranton and see how much it would require to run the branch. The answer might surprise you. It kind of surprised me, but I don't know anything about paper. Let's get right into it. All right, so open up a blank workbook here. And the way I'm going to start this off is just trying to remember all of the employees that Dunder Mifflin has and go through there. However, I won't lie, I have a cheat sheet, so I didn't have to look it up. I'm going to build this out real quick. I'll catch back up as soon as I'm done building out the employee tab, because that's what we're going to start with. I'm going to start with employees. Those are the biggest expense. Let's make some assumptions here. Be right back. Okay, so I'm starting off by coming up with estimated salaries that some of the employees might make. I'm adding in the employers, which would be Dunder Mifflin Scranton's part of payroll tax, which is 7.5%, 8%. Probably depends on where you are in the country, but I'm going to go with 8%. And I took the salary, I multiplied it times 1 plus the taxes they're responsible for, and then divided that by 12. And we come up with a monthly responsibility for Michael. If he's paid $85,000, maybe that's too high, I don't know, of about $7,650. I'm going to go through and do this for the rest of the employees real quick as well. Okay, so I went through and estimated salaries for some of these people, kind of based on some of the episodes that I've seen. And I think, Dwight mentions in one episode he wants to make like $80,000 a year, and it seemed like a crazy amount, or maybe it was $100,000, and seemed like a crazy amount. Also, we know that this show was filmed like maybe late 2000s, early 2010s. So, salaries aren't going to be what they are now, 10 years later. But, reasonable salaries is kind of what I tried to go off of. It seems like Jim would be the highest paid salesperson, and Dwight would probably be next. Maybe Dwight might be the highest paid. Sometimes they brag about him being the best salesperson in the company. Then I would say Andy and Stanley and Phyllis are somewhere around the same range. Also, we're going to kind of assume that the salespeople are commission only and not necessarily have a base salary. That makes the math a little easier in the end, somewhat easier. Also, I love how I'm just sitting here talking about this like it's not a comedy show. It kind of feels strange. But I'm going to keep on going at that. So, Pam's a receptionist, say $15 an hour. That's $30,000 a year. Kevin, I didn't put Toby on the salary. I listed him here, but I didn't put him on the salary because he's a corporate employee. And that's not on the branch that's not on the branch's responsibility. It should be the corporate responsibility. So Ryan's a temp. Let's say this is early stage, like season 1, 2, 3. Ryan's a temp. He doesn't get paid as much. And we kind of go down. And then I don't know exactly how many warehouse workers there are, but I'm assuming there's another 6 warehouse workers outside of Daryl. And assume they get paid an average of about $13 an hour. So we come up with a monthly responsibility of $87,210. So I'm going to go ahead and name this tab personnel. So the next thing we have to do is figure out what are the other expenses that the Dunder Mifflin Scranton branch has to cover in order to operate at least at break even. We know that at times the branch was losing money. Sometimes it's the best performing branch in the company. But let's just see what their monthly nut is. So how much they have to make per month in order to just break even. So G&A expenses are next. So I made some assumptions about what the G&A expenses might entail for a branch like Dunder Mifflin Scranton. Of course, you have insurance, rent, office items, utilities, marketing expenses, internet, phone systems, especially back then. Phone systems were a bigger deal. And then kind of an other category there was where we catch all. For insurance, I'm just going to assume it's probably about $500 a month or something of that size. Rent, they have the office and they have the warehouse. And so all in all, I wouldn't be surprised if they're not at 10 grand a month for as much space as they seem to occupy there. So that's where I'm going to go. Also, they're in the northeast part of the United States, so it's going to be a little more expensive there. Office items, we're talking staplers and pens and paper clips and all of the little things that actually add up to a good chunk of money over time. is what office items are, but we'll say $350 a month. Utilities depends on what kind of lease they're in, but we'll assume that they have some utility responsibility of around $250 a month. Marketing may be a big part of what they do, but they have a lot of salespeople, and it doesn't seem like they enable their salespeople with a lot of marketing, or the marketing may be a corporate expense. But we'll assume that there's some expense associated with marketing of around $500 a month. Internet, usually for business level internet, it's a little bit more expensive. Let's kind of say $250. Phone systems are also expensive, at least they were. They used to be. So we'll say around $250 a month right there. Then the other category, we have expenses like the party planning committee, which I think in one episode, Angela says it's either $300 or $400 a month budget. Who else knows? But we'll say the other category, just to kind of wrap it all in, is around $1,000 a month, which may seem like a lot, but in reality, that's $12,000 a year for a business operating, at the level that they're operating at. It's really not that much money. So I'm going to rename this as G&A. So now that we got personnel and G&A, the other big expense is that the commissions that the salespeople are going to be making. And that also will kind of help us back into the level of revenue based on different margins that are needed in order to sustain the business. So I'm going to go ahead and figure out commissions here. So I did a little digging around to see if there were any clues on the internet about how much salespeople made, or something along the lines of just give me some general guidance so I'm not pulling things out of thin air. And I found a Reddit thread that talked about Jim's commission on a whiteboard, I think in season 7, episode 14. This is the Reddit thread that I have linked right here. So in season 7, episode 14, there was a whiteboard that said Jim made sales of around $67,000 to $68,000 in 3 months. So that's around $22,500 a month, and annualized is $270,000 or something to that effect. So that's what I'm going to start with as our assumed sales per salesperson, and then kind of back it out into those salaries that I assumed in the beginning. So if we do an assumed sales per salesperson of around $270,000, and we can start to play around with a commission. Right now, we'll kind of say the commission is maybe 20%. So make this a percentage. Then the annual salary, if they're commission only, would be 20% times their sales, $54,000. And we assumed Jim was making $55,000. Okay, so knowing that 20% commission is something that we can work with, let's go and break down all the expenses and come up with a total revenue that would be required to cover the total expenses for Dunder Mifflin Scranton, and work off of that as how much money they wound up making. So come to a breakdown tab and go ahead. So we know that at the top level, we have personnel, and the total expense for personnel can be pulled from this tab right here, which come up with $87,210. Of course, granted, these are all assumptions that can be played with, but this is how I generally start to break down businesses. And this can be applied to anything. This can be applied to a Chick-fil-A. If you go through and you say, well, how many employees do they have? And what would be the average pay of those employees? Then you can at least get to how much they have to make in order to sustain themselves. And that'll give you a good idea of what profitability is too. Because you could assume profit margins in different industries just by looking them up. Okay, so we have personnel. Then we have G&A. And from the G&A tab, we can sum these expenses, $13,100. So I'm going to go here and reference that cell. And then we can say, well, those are the total cash outflows, because we're going to assume that inventory is handled by corporate, and this is just what they have to have in order to break even. Once again, so So total cash outflows per month, and this is important. Whoops. Is around $100,000. So that's $1.2 million a year that has to be generated in gross margin in order to even break even as a branch. All right, I'm going to start breaking down the sales and the commissions based on the salaries that I had before, and then we can reference if those salaries are enough, and then kind of come off with an estimated commission rate based on those to get to at least the annual that is $100,000 a month. So if that didn't make a whole lot of sense, just keep watching. So I have all the salespeople lined up here, and what we're going to do is we're going to take the annual salary that we assume they make, which for Jim is $55,000, and then we're going to divide that by the assumed commission right here, and we'll say, okay, then Jim has to make $275,000 a year in sales that we came up with earlier in order to actually cover his salary at a 20% commission. And so then we got to figure out the margins they're making these sales at, and then we'll back that out. But this would be the revenue generated by Jim. And we should be able to pull that down for everybody except Packer, which is not true because I didn't lock this cell. Lock that cell and try it again. And then for Packer, we'll just go down and reference his salary here and do this one manually. And so the total annual sales would be what's generated by the salespeople, and that's $1.5 million, which, you know, at the face level, it seems like, okay, well, that's enough to cover 1.20 through 1.203720. But it's not, because this doesn't have any margin baked into it. This doesn't have, you know, they're not making all of this. I assume paper sales at really thin margins. And if you're paying your salespeople 20% commission, then you don't have much left over for yourself. That's another reason I'm thinking that 20% commission is way too high. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to go and say 10% is where it is. And we're going to have to double this is what we're going to have to do in order for this annual salary number to make any sense whatsoever. So that's $540,000. I'm also going to say that, you know, the whiteboard that was shown in season 7, episode 14, completely unrealistic. There's no way you can pay your salespeople 20% commission and have any margin left over for yourself, especially in paper, I guess. So the reason I'm making that point is because I looked up the gross margins of Office Depot, which is in the paper business, and they're around 30%. So if you have 30% gross margins and you pay your salespeople 20%, you're leaving 10% left over to operate the business on. There's no way. It even seems like 10% commission is too high, but I'm going to use 10% just to kind of work off of. So I'm going to say assumed gross margin 30%. So we have total annual sales of $3 million, and based on the salaries we assumed on the first tab. And if we have an assumed gross margin of 30%, then we have gross revenue of 30% times the total annual sales. Once again, not enough money is where it kind of looks at, because the gross revenue of $894,000 has to meet this $1.2 million. Let's just say $1.2 million. It's not there. So we either have to make the gross margin go up, 35%, still not enough, 40%, still not enough, 45%, that's enough, which I think that's too high of a gross margin for paper. Or we have to assume more annual sales for the salespeople, or a lower commission ultimately, so that their sales numbers drive up. So if we go to an 8% commission, then each salesperson has to sell even more. And the total annual sales goes up to $3.7 million at a 30% gross margin, we're still not at break even. And so now we can begin to understand that why Dunder Mifflin Scranton was always on the chopping block, why Dunder Mifflin was struggling as a business, because thin margins are really hard to operate on. And so we'll go to 0.07 here, and that's barely it. So if you're paying your salespeople 7% commission, then Jim and Dwight and Andy and all the other ones, they have to sell $700,000 a piece on average worth of paper in order to get to $4.2 million in annual sales just to cover everything else. So this is a great example of thin margins, 30% thin margins, because you don't have much left over to operate the company on. So gross revenue, $1.2 million. This is actually surprising to me that Michael Scott operates on a budget of $4.25 million. The sales, $4.25 million. That seems like a lot of money. And that's only break even. So this was a fun video to make. I know this isn't the traditional P&L forecast or cash flow forecast or breakdown where I kind of go monthly. It's more of how do we look at a business and make assumptions and get to what seems like a reasonable estimate of what the revenue would be based on very limited knowledge. And this is how I do it. This is what I do. First, I look at their big expenses, then I assume some other things, because at the end of the day, the G&A is this is 13% of the cash outflows per month. If this got bumped up to 16% or down to 10%, it wouldn't make that big of a difference. And we can look at salaries and get pretty close. So all in all, this may be plus or minus 5 to 10% from reality, but I bet it's 5 to 10% from reality and not that far off, because these things are easy to assume. They're easy to understand. And this can be done for any business type. If you can just look at it analytically and say, these are their main expenses, what do they have to do? What do they have to make in order to operate? And then what do they have to do in order to get to industry standard profit margins? So if they're getting to industry standard profit margins, which in paper is probably like 10%, what do they have to earn in order to get to a 10% profit margin? So we can do that too. We can say, all right, net profit. And the gross revenue minus the annual outflows, and we could say profit margin. And so that's the net profit divided by the revenue. And right now we're at 2%, right? Not very good. So there's a bunch of ways that we could get to a desired profit margin of 10%. And we know that's what we want to see here. But ultimately, it's a factor of sales. And salespeople's salaries are what's driving the total annual sales all the way back here on the personnel page. So if we said, let's bump everybody's salary 10%, roughly. So let's go 60. Let's just have everybody make $60,000 a year, all the way down to Packer. And that'll be reflected all the way through. So cash outflows goes up, annual sales goes up, gross revenue goes up, and net profit's now up. But now we're still only at 5% net profit. So we got to go even more. So let's do 70. And my formatting is messing up, but that's okay. So at $70,000 a year, they're nice round numbers all the way across the board. I guess that makes sense because we're at 7% commission. Nevertheless, we're at $6 million in annual sales and still only at an 8% profit margin for the branch. So we got to keep going, and we can do this with Solver if we wanted to, but last try, $75,000. And we're pretty close, 8.72. So you're around $80,000, around $7 million in annual sales is where we would see a 10% profit margin, which I'm assuming is what they may be shooting for in order to be sustainable long term. And that's making $500,000 a year. That's pretty good. So this is a fun breakdown, and I picked Dunder Mifflin because most people know what it is. Most people know the key components, and they're familiar with the show. But this is applicable to anything, any business whatsoever that you may want to break down. So if you like this style of video, if you like these style of breakdowns, and you got anything out of it, then let me know. And I look forward to the next one. Thanks. Bye.